I'm Evelyn, 62 years old, and I spent half my life building a home that in the end became the very place where I was betrayed. Last night, in the middle of our 35th wedding anniversary party, my daughter-in-law casually walked through my living room with a tape measure in her hand while my husband stood there nodding in agreement that I should be moved into a nursing home. What they didn't know was that by the very next morning, I had frozen every bank account, and the house they were so desperate to claim had already been sold out from under them. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments below. And make sure to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth. It all began on the very night of my anniversary with Richard. The sharp snap of a tape measure cut straight through the soft jazz, drifting through the living room. My daughter-in-law, Maya, was standing in the middle of my expensive Persian rug, pulling the metal tape from the fireplace all the way to the edge of the window frame. Then she turned to my son Harrison and said that if they knocked out that wall, their imported Italian sectional would fit much better. I froze in the kitchen doorway, still holding a tray of steaming hot turkey in both hands. That was my house. The house was in my name. The house where I had personally chosen every single piece of furniture. And yet Maya was acting like I was already dead, and she was measuring the space to divide up the inheritance. I walked forward, set the tray down on the dining table, and looked her straight in the eye. "What exactly are you doing?" She didn't even bother looking up at me. She just shrugged and kept typing numbers into her phone. Then Richard, my husband, walked in from the patio, holding a glass of expensive wine in his hand. And instead of telling my daughter-in-law to stop her outrageous behavior, he looked at me with complete indifference and said, "You'll be moving into Silver Pines Luxury Senior Living next month anyway. This house will be far too big for you." The entire room went silent. Richard's words hit me like ice water, thrown straight across my face in front of every guest in that room. 35 years of sacrifice. 35 years of stepping back so he could rise through the ranks and become a chief financial officer. And this was how he chose to repay me by sentencing me to exile from my own home. Maya smiled and folded up the tape measure with a smug little grin. My son Harrison lowered his eyes and couldn't even look at me. They had planned all of this ahead of time. Every word, every move. And they had already decided that I was nothing more than an old piece of furniture that needed to be removed. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. 30 years of being the quiet, patient, devoted wife had made them forget one very important thing. Before I ever got married, I was an exceptional forensic accountant. So I simply gave them a small, calm smile, took one step back, and said, "I understand." Later that night, after the party was over and the guests had all gone home, I stayed behind to clean the living room. When I picked up Richard's suit jacket to hang it away, a small slip of paper fell out of his pocket. It wasn't a receipt for an anniversary gift for me. It was a receipt for a $45,000 diamond necklace delivered to an unfamiliar luxury apartment in downtown Manhattan. The betrayal wasn't just coming from my greedy children. It was coming from the man I had given my youth, my loyalty, and my entire life to. I held that receipt in my hand. My heartbeat stayed perfectly steady, but in my mind I had already started calculating my next move. The room fell into silence after Richard's announcement. He stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the Persian rug. He wasn't looking at me like a husband of 35 years. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a failed investment that needs to be liquidated. Then Richard placed his hand on Maya's shoulder, a quiet gesture of agreement that made my stomach twist. "Maya's right, Evelyn," he said in that smooth, polished voice, the same voice he used when firing hundreds of employees at his company. "This house is too large for you to manage on your own. Those stairs aren't good for your knees anymore. I already put down a deposit at Silver Pines. They even have an excellent memory care unit there, just in case you need it. Silver Pines, a luxury facility where wealthy families dump their elderly relatives and call it compassion." He was packaging me up and throwing me away. I stood there frozen, still holding the heavy silver tray with the roasted turkey in both hands. The heat from the metal burned through my oven gloves, but I didn't drop it. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl that tray straight into his smug face. Instead, I bit down hard on my lower lip, so hard I could taste my own blood. My knuckles turned white around the tray. At that moment, physical pain was the only thing keeping me grounded. And in my mind, the last 30 years began to flash before me like a reel of film played at double speed. I remembered the tiny apartment in Queens where we started. I was the one working 60 hours a week as a forensic accountant so Richard could finish his MBA. I was the one who caught the irregularities in the books at his first company, saving him from a major fraud scandal and handing him the career opportunity that launched everything. When Harrison was born, Richard told me that my job had become an inconvenience. He needed a wife who could host elegant dinner parties for clients and raise the perfect son. So I stepped back. I traded spreadsheets and audits for PTA meetings and perfectly manicured lawns. I built this fortress so he could become the chief financial officer of a massive corporation. I created him, and now he was trying to erase me from the very life I had built with my own hands. Maya folded her arms, a triumphant little smile curling on her lips. Then she looked over at Harrison, my son, the child I had stayed up all night for, through fevers, heartbreak, and disappointment after disappointment. Harrison couldn't even meet my eyes. He stared down at the tips of his shoes, completely complicit in his silence. He was now a vice president of marketing, a title his father had practically bought for him, and he was never going to bite the hand that fed him, even if that meant throwing his own mother to the wolves. "You'd love Silver Pines, Mom," Maya cut in, her voice dripping with fake concern. "They have water aerobics on Tuesdays, and honestly, it would give Harrison and me the space we need to finally start our family properly. We need to open up this living room to make room for the baby's play area." She had already started redesigning everything. She was erasing me while I was still standing there in the room. Richard's co-workers and the people who were supposed to be our friends looked away awkwardly. Not a single person stepped in. In this world, power is the only currency that matters, and Richard was the one holding all the cards, or at least that's what they thought. I swallowed the blood in my mouth. I forced every muscle in my face to relax, and suddenly the forensic accountant inside me, the woman who had been asleep for 3 decades, woke up. She didn't feel grief. She felt calculation, cold, precise, ruthless. When a company is facing a hostile takeover, you don't cry, you audit. I looked at Richard, his custom-tailored suit, his perfectly styled silver hair, the arrogance radiating from every inch of him. He was far too confident in his victory. He thought he had completely disarmed me. He thought I was just a naive housewife who didn't know the difference between a checking account and a trust fund. I took a slow breath, letting the smell of roasted turkey and expensive perfume fill my lungs. Then I walked calmly to the dining table. I set the tray down with a low, decisive thud. I removed my oven gloves and placed them neatly beside the serving spoons. "That sounds very thoughtful, Richard," I said. My voice was perfectly calm. It didn't shake at all. It was the voice of a woman discussing the weather. I picked up a napkin and gently dabbed the blood from my lip. "Silver Pines. I suppose I'll need to start packing." Richard smiled, visibly relieved that I wasn't making a scene. He lifted his glass toward the room. "To new beginnings," he declared. "To new beginnings," Maya echoed, her eyes gleaming with greed. I turned and walked back into the kitchen. The swinging door closed behind me, cutting off the cheerful chatter and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. The moment I was out of their sight, I leaned against the marble counter. My heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. They thought they had won. They thought the game was over. What they didn't realize was that I had spent the last 30 years watching every financial move Richard ever made. I knew exactly where the darkest secrets were buried. I knew the passwords the offshore accounts and the shell companies created to dodge taxes. They wanted to take my house. They wanted to steal my life. But they had forgotten one critical detail. I was the one who poured the foundation beneath this family, and I knew exactly which support beams to pull, to make the entire structure collapse right on top of them. The party finally came to an end. The last of the guests drifted out the door carrying their hollow congratulations and fake smiles with them. Richard walked them to their cars with the polished charm of a powerful chief financial officer. He threw an arm around Harrison's shoulders and patted his son's back like a king passing down his crown to the next heir. Maya brushed past me without a single word of thanks, without even the smallest trace of respect. She just smiled and told Richard she'd call the contractor first thing in the morning to tear down the living room wall. Then they walked out, leaving me alone in the ruins of my 35 years of youth. So I started cleaning. That was what I had always done. That was what a perfect wife, a woman who had given up her career to become the silent foundation beneath everyone else's success, was expected to do. I gathered the expensive crystal glasses, the fine china plates smeared with leftovers. The sound of running water filled the kitchen sink, breaking the suffocating silence of the house. The hot water turned my hands red, but I didn't feel a thing. The only sensation left inside me was a terrifying numbness. Richard went straight upstairs. He didn't look at me once. He didn't ask how I felt about his decision to send me away to Silver Pines. To him, I was already a problem that had been solved, a debt that had finally been cleared. I dried each glass carefully and placed it back into the cabinet. Every soft clink of crystal against crystal reminded me how fragile this family really was. A family I had sacrificed my entire life to protect, and now it had shattered in just a few cruel sentences. When the kitchen was spotless, I walked back into the living room. The Persian rug still carried the marks of the guests' shoes. The wall Maya was so eager to demolish still stood there tall and untouched. I moved through the room, picking up napkins tossed carelessly onto the floor. And that was when I saw Richard's jacket. His custom-tailored suit jacket, made from one of those absurdly expensive wool-silk blends he loved to wear, was draped over the arm of the sofa. I stepped toward it, intending to hang it up. It was nothing more than habit, nothing more than the reflex of a woman who had spent 3 decades taking care of a man who no longer saw her as human. But the moment my hand touched the soft fabric, I felt something stiff inside the breast pocket. It wasn't the shape of a business card. It wasn't a note. It had the unmistakable feel of a thermal-printed receipt from a luxury store. My heart skipped once. Yesterday had been our 35th wedding anniversary. Richard hadn't given me a single gift all night. The only thing he had offered me was a one-way ticket to memory care. For one foolish second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had planned some last-minute surprise. Maybe that slip of paper was proof that a tiny fragment of conscience still remained inside the man I had once loved with my whole soul. But wounded wives tell themselves stupid little lies. So I reached into the pocket and pulled the paper out. Under the dim golden light of the living room, I unfolded it and let my eyes scan the sharp black print. Cartier. 5th Avenue location. Total charged $45,000. Item purchased 1 diamond necklace. I stopped breathing. $45,000. That was more than I used to make in an entire year back when I was still working as a forensic accountant. The purchase date was yesterday. But the thing that truly turned the blood in my veins to ice wasn't the amount. It was the delivery note printed at the bottom. The recipient's name was not Evelyn Mercer. The delivery address was not this suburban home. The package was addressed to Chloe Adams, a name I had never heard before, a woman I had never met. And the necklace had been delivered to a luxury apartment in the heart of Manhattan, miles away from the house where I had spent 35 years being a loyal wife. I stood there frozen, the thin receipt trembling in my shaking hands. There had been no anniversary gift, no remorse, no last-minute apology. Richard didn't just want me out of the house so our son and daughter-in-law could move in. He wanted me erased so he could clear the path for a brand new life with another woman, a woman named Chloe, a woman who was almost certainly younger, prettier, and untouched by the scars of 35 years spent sacrificing herself for him. And suddenly everything came into focus with horrifying clarity. Maya measuring the living room, Harrison refusing to meet my eyes, Richard casually announcing my move to a nursing home in front of a room full of people. None of it had been impulsive. None of it had been accidental. It was a plan, carefully calculated, methodical, cold. They had made a dirty little deal. Richard would give my son and his wife this house. In return, they would stay quiet and help him dispose of me as neatly and quietly as possible. My son, the child I had carried inside my body, my daughter-in-law, the man I had spent 35 years serving. Together they had dug a grave for me, and they fully intended to bury me in it while I was still alive. I had faced hundreds of sophisticated financial fraud cases in my career. I had dissected fake ledgers, shell companies, forged records, and polished lies designed to hide greed. I had seen the ugliest ways people deceive each other for money. But I had never imagined that the most ruthless fraud of all would happen under my own roof, committed by the very people who shared my table and my blood. Still, I didn't cry. The pain had gone far beyond tears. So I folded the receipt carefully, smoothing out every crease, and slipped it deep into the pocket of my apron. It was no longer just a receipt. It was evidence. It was a weapon. It was the opening shot of a war they had no idea was coming. I looked around the elegant living room. At the walls Maya wanted destroyed. At the sofa where Richard had been sitting just hours earlier, they thought I was a confused old woman, a weak disposable burden, a piece on the board that had already lost its value. They had forgotten something vital. The woman who had once exposed some of the most corrupt financial empires in the industry was still alive inside me. Richard may have believed he was the master manipulator in this house. But he had made one fatal mistake. He left a trail. And no one on this earth was better at following the trail of a crime than a forensic accountant. I walked to the light switch and turned off the lamp. The living room sank into absolute silence and shadow. Tomorrow they would come charging in with legal documents. They would corner me, pressure me, try to force me to sign away the remains of my life. But what they didn't know was this. Tonight, Evelyn Mercer, the obedient, patient, submissive wife, had officially died. And the woman walking out of this darkness would be someone else entirely, a woman who was ready to burn every last one of her betrayers to the ground. The game had only just begun, and I was going to make sure they paid dearly for every drop of youth they had drained from me. The next morning, I woke up at 5. 35 years of being a wife doesn't disappear in a single night. I walked downstairs and brewed a pot of the dark roast coffee Richard demanded every morning. The machine hissed in the silence. The $45,000 Cartier receipt was already locked away inside my personal safe, hidden beneath the lining of my mother's old jewelry box. My mind felt strangely empty. There was no jealousy, no desperate tears, only numbers, and pieces of logic slowly sliding into place. Chloe Adams, a stranger's name, but the final piece that explained Richard's coldness over the last 2 years. At exactly 7 o'clock, footsteps echoed down the oak hallway. Not the footsteps of one person, a series of heavy, deliberate steps, like an occupying force marching in to seize control. The kitchen door swung open. Richard entered first. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silk tie neatly fastened, looking as if he were about to walk into the most critical board meeting of his life. Right behind him came my daughter-in-law Maya, wearing a fitted light gray office dress and clutching a thick stack of documents to her chest. Harrison followed behind her, quiet and withdrawn, his eyes avoiding any kind of contact. And then came the fourth person, a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing an ash-gray suit and carrying a polished black leather briefcase. The four of them stepped into my kitchen and surrounded the marble island. The air in the room changed instantly. It became suffocating, oppressive, so heavy with betrayal that I could practically feel it pressing against my ribs. "Good morning, Evelyn," Richard said, breaking the silence. His voice was flat, emotionless. "We have some important matters to take care of today. This is Attorney Sterling. He's here to help us finalize the legal paperwork for the transfer." The transfer, such a beautiful word for theft. I set my coffee cup down on the stone countertop and gripped the edge of the island with both hands to keep myself from trembling. The transfer of what I asked, deliberately letting my voice shake with confusion, the voice of an older woman who didn't understand what was happening. Maya stepped forward and dropped the thick file onto the counter with a sharp, dry slap. "Mom, we already talked about this last night," she said, her tone shrill with fake sympathy and naked superiority. "Your health isn't what it used to be. Managing a house this large is too much for you now. We only want what's best for you. Mr. Sterling has already prepared a full financial power of attorney and the transfer papers for the house. All you have to do is sign, and we'll take care of the rest." Attorney Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 neatly clipped document packets. He slid them toward me along with a gold-plated pen. "Mrs. Mercer, this is all very standard," he said smoothly. "This power of attorney will allow your son and daughter-in-law to handle your finances, pay for your care at Silver Pines, and manage your assets on your behalf. As for the deed transfer that will place the home under Maya's limited liability company so it can be used as collateral for business expansion, everything is transparent and fully legal." I lowered my eyes to the dense black print covering the white pages. They thought I was stupid. A full financial power of attorney was not just paperwork. It was a death sentence for my independence. If I signed it, they would have the power to empty every bank account I owned, sell every asset in my name, and reduce me to a penniless woman completely dependent on their mercy. And the transfer of the house to Maya's private company, not even to my son Harrison personally, made their strategy painfully obvious. She wanted full control. She didn't just want to secure the property. She wanted to absorb it, even if that meant cutting her own husband out of the core ownership. Richard folded his arms across his chest, his eyes sharp and cold as blades. "Sign it, Evelyn. Don't waste everyone's time. You've been sitting at home for 30 years without earning a single income. I paid the bills. I kept this family afloat. This house should have been in my name a long time ago. Now it's time for you to do something useful for your son. Let Harrison have a chance to grow his career instead of selfishly clinging to a pile of bricks you can't even maintain by yourself." His words hit me like repeated blows to the chest. 30 years without earning anything. He had conveniently forgotten who stayed up all night fixing the accounting irregularities that could have ruined him. He had forgotten who kept him out of legal disaster in the early years of his career. He had rewritten history so completely that he now believed he alone had been the savior of this family. I turned to Harrison. He was still staring at the floor, both hands gripping the hem of his shirt. "Harrison," I asked softly, letting a faint tremor enter my voice, "do you really think I'm a useless burden? Do you really want to throw me out of the very home where I raised you?" He flinched. Then he glanced awkwardly at Maya, then at his father. "Mom, I'm sorry," he muttered weakly in that small, cowardly voice of his. "But Maya's company urgently needs capital. Dad's right. You need to rest. Silver Pines has doctors on duty 24 hours a day. It would be better for all of us." Better for all of us. No, better for them. Richard would be free to move in with his younger mistress, Chloe Adams, without having to divide up assets in a divorce. Maya would gain a major property to prop up her struggling cosmetics company. Harrison would continue being the obedient son and compliant husband, hiding under the shadow of stronger manipulators. They had cornered me. They had sealed every exit. They had brought a lawyer into my kitchen to carry out a civil execution in broad daylight. I took a slow breath. My hands trembled very deliberately as I reached toward the gold pen. Maya smiled, a bright, greedy, victorious smile. Richard let out a quiet breath of relief, as if some terrible burden were finally being lifted. They believed, the 4 of them, the presence of a lawyer and a stack of cold legal threats had shattered me completely. They believed I was just a weak old woman with no fight left in her. I picked up the pen and held it above the paper. Then I stopped. I looked up at the lawyer with the most clouded, confused expression I could manage. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice unsteady and hesitant. "The print is too small. I can't read these terms clearly. Ever since my eyesight got worse, I can't read legal documents without my glasses. I need to go upstairs and find them. It won't take long, just 5 minutes." Richard clicked his tongue in irritation, but he didn't object. "Hurry up, Evelyn," he snapped. "Attorney Sterling has to get back to court. And don't try anything." I nodded and turned away, shuffling out of the kitchen. The moment the kitchen door closed behind me and I was out of their sight, the fake trembling vanished. My spine straightened, my eyes hardened. I was not going upstairs for my glasses. I went straight to Richard's office, because that room held every filthy truth they were trying so desperately to bury. And 5 minutes was more than enough time for a forensic accountant to begin a brutal counterattack. I stood there staring at the white pages spread across the marble countertop, packed tight with dense black legal text. The air in the kitchen had turned suffocating. Maya stepped forward, her high heels striking the hardwood with one sharp, hollow click. She crossed her arms over her chest, the posture of a young woman who believed she held all the power in the room, and then she began speaking in that carefully measured voice designed to crush whatever dignity I had left. "Mom, we need to be honest with each other," she said sweetly, but her eyes were as cold as glass. "For the last 30 years, you've had an incredibly comfortable life. You lived in a huge house, shopped with unlimited credit cards, and the hardest part of your day was deciding whether dinner would be chicken or fish. But the real world doesn't work like that. Dad has worked himself to exhaustion for decades, carrying unbearable pressure as a chief financial officer just to maintain this perfect little life for you. You never brought a single dollar into this family. You were never the provider. You were just the one spending the money. And now that your health is declining and your memory isn't what it used to be, you can't keep clinging to things that were never truly yours." Every word Maya spoke sliced into me like an invisible blade. A parasite, a useless woman, a wife who contributed nothing but expenses. She erased my entire youth in a matter of seconds. She had no idea that I was the one who scraped together every miserable paycheck from my accounting job to cover our rent when Richard was still an intern struggling to survive. She didn't know that the powerful CFO position he held today had been built on top of financial reports. I stayed up all night cleaning up his deadly mistakes before they could destroy his career. Richard stood right beside her without the slightest hesitation. He nodded along while his daughter-in-law humiliated his wife. "Maya's right, Evelyn," he said, his voice deep, steady, and full of authority. "You need to face reality. Yes, the house is in your name. But who paid the mortgage? Who paid the property taxes for the last 3 decades? Me. Everything you have on your body, from the clothes you're wearing to the breakfast you ate this morning, came from my labor. You've enjoyed my protection long enough. Now it's time for you to do the decent thing. Moving you into Silver Pines isn't a punishment. It's the most practical arrangement for someone who can no longer contribute. Sign the papers so Harrison can finally take over what should have belonged to him years ago." I turned to look at Harrison, my son, the final fragile hope in a mother's heart. But Harrison just kept his head down and avoided my eyes. He rubbed his hands together nervously and muttered his pathetic little excuse in a weak, cowardly voice. "Just sign it, Mom. Maya's company is on the verge of collapse if it doesn't get new capital. Dad's right. You can't manage everything on your own anymore. Sign it, so I won't have to be seen as an ungrateful son who failed to support the family's future." The shamelessness of it was beyond anything human decency should have allowed. They didn't just want to steal my house, they wanted me to kneel down and thank them for stealing it. They were using the cruelest form of psychological warfare there is, twisting the truth until I was supposed to believe I was the burden, the broken old woman, the freeloader. So I gave them exactly the performance they wanted. I became the frightened 62-year-old woman, cornered and falling apart. I bent forward slightly, my shoulders trembling. My hand reached for the edge of the Marble Island, fingers curling around it, as if I were desperately searching for something solid to keep me upright. I let my breathing turn ragged and uneven, each breath sounding shallow and strained. Attorney Sterling saw his opening immediately. He pushed the power of attorney and the property transfer papers closer to me. Then he tapped the gold pen lightly against the countertop. "You only need to sign here and here, Mrs. Mercer," he said smoothly. "Everything will be over very quickly, and then you can go upstairs and rest." I picked up the pen. My hand shook so violently that the tip dragged across the page, leaving behind a faint streak of ink. But beneath that trembling shell, my mind was calmer and sharper than it had been in years. My eyes moved across the tiny printed lines. "The habits of a forensic accountant do not die. They wait. First page financial power of attorney." This was not a standard document that would only take effect if I became legally incapacitated. This was a full, unlimited power of attorney effective immediately. If I signed it, Richard and Maya would have the authority to drain my retirement funds, sell any asset in my name, and even borrow money under my identity. Second page property transfer. The house was not being transferred to my son Harrison. The receiving entity was an LLC called Nova Beauty. I recognized the name instantly. It was Maya's cosmetics company, and she was the sole executive. They had structured the deal to cut Harrison out completely. If they divorced one day, Harrison would walk away with nothing, while Maya would keep my house. And Richard, he had agreed to it, because that was the price he was willing to pay to keep Maya silent about his younger mistress, Chloe Adams. A filthy arrangement, cold, calculated, merciless. But they had forgotten one thing. If you want to deceive a forensic accountant, you need more than a cheap lawyer and a stack of intimidation tactics. I let the pen slip from my fingers. It hit the marble with a dry, sharp clatter. Then I pressed a hand to my chest and winced, pretending to be hit by a wave of pain. I gasped for breath and lifted my face toward Maya with blurred, helpless eyes. "I can't," I whispered weakly. "The print is too small. It's all blurry. I can't read these terms. Ever since my eyesight got worse, I can't see anything without my glasses. I can't sign something I can't even read." Richard made an impatient sound and slammed his palm against the countertop. "Stop stalling, Evelyn. You don't need to read it. The lawyer already explained everything. All you have to do is sign." Maya stepped even closer, the irritation in her eyes now impossible to hide. "Mom, you're wasting everyone's time. Mr. Sterling bills by the hour, and we do not have time for this nonsense. Just sign." I shook my head. This time I let fake tears gather at the corners of my eyes. "No," I sobbed softly. "I really can't see anything. My head is spinning. The letters and numbers are all blending together. Please, just give me 5 minutes. My glasses are on the nightstand in my bedroom. Let me go get them, read this once, and then I'll sign. I promise, just 5 minutes." The tension in that kitchen became so thick it felt almost visible. Sterling looked at his watch, then turned to Richard and gave him a small nod. "Let her get the glasses, Mr. Mercer. We need her signature to be voluntary. If there's too much pressure, the agreement could be challenged and invalidated in court." Richard stepped back with obvious fury and cleared the path for me. "Fine," he growled. "You have exactly 5 minutes. If you're not back downstairs with your signature on those papers, I'll call an ambulance and have you taken straight to the psychiatric unit at Silver Pines." I gave a small, defeated nod. Using the edge of the marble island for support, I slowly pushed myself upright and began walking toward the door with the heavy, dragging steps of a sick old woman. I passed the cold, merciless faces of the people who used to be my family. Every step was an insult, but every step was also freedom. The moment I crossed the kitchen doorway and placed my foot on the first wooden stair, I heard Maya whisper behind me, "This old woman is such a problem. We should have done this 2 years ago." I didn't turn around. I kept walking. And the second the kitchen door closed behind me, and their eyes were no longer on me, every trace of shaking panic and weakness vanished as if it had never existed. My spine went straight. My eyes went dry and sharp as razors. My heartbeat became steady again. They thought they had broken me. They thought these 5 minutes were for me to fetch a pair of reading glasses from my bedroom. What they didn't know was that these 5 minutes were for me to walk into Richard's office, open his safe, and begin a counterattack that would strip them of everything they were so desperate to steal. I was not going upstairs to find my glasses. I was going upstairs to find the death sentence for their greed. I stepped into Richard's office and locked the thick oak door behind me. The dry click of the lock echoed through the room, sealing me away from the vultures waiting downstairs in the kitchen. They had given me 5 minutes. For an ordinary woman, 5 minutes would have been just enough time to fumble around for a forgotten pair of reading glasses. But for a forensic accountant who had spent years dissecting the most sophisticated money laundering schemes in elite circles, 5 minutes was an eternity. I crossed the room to Richard's mahogany desk and powered on the desktop computer. The monitor lit up, throwing a cold glow across a room built on lies. Richard had always been proud of his so-called security. He changed his passwords constantly, but what he forgot was this. I was the one who had taught him how to think logically in the first place. It took me exactly 45 seconds to break through his personal firewall and access the family cloud storage system. My fingers moved across the keyboard with perfect precision, not the slightest tremor in them. I wasn't searching for our joint bank accounts. I went straight for the hidden folders, the ones carefully disguised as archived corporate tax files. I understood how money moved. Money never simply disappears. It only changes form. And then I found it. A bank statement from a private institution in the Cayman Islands, an account Richard had never mentioned to me. 3 months earlier, a wire transfer of $2 million had been executed. $2 million. That wasn't spare cash. That was the core of our retirement fund, the money we had built over 35 years of sweat sacrifice and sleepless nights completely drained. The transaction memo was short but sharp enough to cut through bone. Full cash payment for real estate. The beneficiary was a trust under the name Chloe Adams. The $45,000 Cartier necklace receipt I had found the night before, that was nothing but a cheap tip. Richard had used the blood of my youth and the security of my old age to buy a luxury apartment for his young mistress. I sat there staring at the numbers on the screen. But the cruelest part, the thing that truly crushed whatever remained of my heart, wasn't the money. It was the next file. I opened Richard's personal message sync. Then I typed one name into the search bar, Maya. A long thread of messages appeared. I scrolled back exactly 6 months and found a photo Maya herself had sent him. It was a stolen picture of Richard kissing Chloe Adams at some expensive restaurant. The message beneath it wasn't outrage. It wasn't disgust on behalf of the mother-in-law who had welcomed her into this family. It was blackmail wrapped in the language of family loyalty. Maya had written, "Dad Harrison, and I know about this girl Chloe. We understand that you need space. We can keep this completely secret so Mom never has to find out. In return, my company desperately needs a strong asset to use as collateral for investors. Your current house is the perfect option. You handle the legal paperwork to get Mom into a nursing home, and we'll handle the silence and the cleanup." Richard had replied 2 minutes later with one short sentence, "Agreed. Follow the plan exactly, but do not let their mother become suspicious." 6 months. For 6 straight months, they had sat across the dinner table from me. And Harrison, the son I had carried inside my body, had eaten the meals I cooked with my own hands every single day. Maya had smiled sweetly while accepting expensive jewelry I bought for her. Richard had held me in bed at night and talked to me about planting more roses in the garden. And all that time, the 3 of them had been hiding the ugliest betrayal imaginable. They had woven a perfect web of lies to strip me of everything I owned. My own son had sold out his mother to fund his wife's business ambition. The man I had given my youth to had sold out his family to buy himself a carefree new life with his mistress. They had put me on a scale, weighed my worth, and assigned me a price. And that price was exile. I sat motionless in Richard's expensive leather chair. For one brief moment, it felt as though all the oxygen had been pulled out of the room. A wave of ice ran from the top of my head all the way down my spine, sliding into every cell in my body. If this had been the Evelyn of yesterday, the patient wife, the soft woman, the one who still believed in family, I might have collapsed right there over his desk. I might have run downstairs screaming, slapped every one of them across the face, and begged the universe for justice through tears and humiliation. But that Evelyn died in this room. The moment those filthy messages lit up in front of me, the last trace of pain inside me burned away completely. It left no ashes of weakness behind, only something cold, something hard, something sharp enough to cut through anyone who stood in my way. The conflict inside me reached its breaking point, and in that exact instant, it transformed into a terrifying calm. I smiled, a small, hollow smile, the kind of smile that comes just before destruction. They had made one catastrophic mistake. They had awakened a monster they had no power to control. I didn't cry, not even once. I opened the deepest drawer of the desk and pulled out a small storage device. Then, as fast as my hands could move, I copied everything. The Cayman Islands bank statement, the purchase records for Chloe Adams' apartment, and every filthy message exchanged between the 3 of them. They thought they were burying a confused old woman. What they didn't realize was that they had just handed me every weapon and every bullet I needed to destroy their reputations, their careers, and their lives. I pulled out the storage device and tucked it deep inside my blouse just above my heart, a heart that was no longer broken, only cold. Then I reached for the reading glasses Richard had left on the desk, long ago slipped them on, and took one long, steady breath. I straightened my blouse, smoothed my hair. The 5 minutes were over. It was time to go back downstairs. It was time to keep playing the trembling, obedient victim just a little longer. I would sign their worthless draft papers if I had to. I would let them savor their illusion of victory for just a little while longer, right before I brought the entire sky crashing down on top of them. I came down the last stair holding my old reading glasses in my hand. In the kitchen, 3 family members and 1 lawyer were still standing there waiting for their prey to surrender. I slipped on the glasses, let my hands tremble, and picked up the gold-plated pen. I played the role perfectly, the frightened, confused, aging woman they thought they had already broken. I even let the pen drag a long, crooked line across the page before I shakily signed both the power of attorney and the asset transfer documents. The moment my final signature was finished, Maya could barely contain her greed. She lunged forward and snatched the papers like a starving animal tearing into fresh meat. Richard exhaled in relief, adjusted the button on his suit jacket, and didn't even bother to look at me. Then they left the house quickly, carrying with them the illusion of an easy victory. What they did not know was that those signatures had absolutely no legal value over assets that had already been placed inside an irrevocable trust. But they were perfect evidence of attempted fraud. Exactly 3 days after they secured those worthless signatures, the roar of a large moving truck shook the front driveway. At that moment, I was outside on the porch, watering my rose bushes. I watched 6 broad-shouldered men in navy uniforms step out of the truck. They carried stacks of cardboard boxes, rolls of packing tape, and giant sheets of plastic wrap. They were movers from a professional relocation company. A sleek luxury sports car pulled up right behind them and stopped sharply at the gate. Maya stepped out of the driver's seat, wearing a beige silk dress, designer heels, and the smug expression of a woman who thought she had already won. One hand held an expensive coffee, the other carried a tablet. She walked toward my front door like a queen leading soldiers into captured territory. She didn't knock. She shoved open the heavy oak door, and the movers marched straight into my house. Their muddy shoes crushed the Persian rug I had spent years keeping spotless. Maya stood in the middle of my living room and started barking orders. She pointed toward my study, then the kitchen, then the upstairs bedroom. With a voice full of contempt, she told the foreman to pack up everything that belonged to that old woman and throw it into the cheapest boxes possible, because all of it was just going into some tiny room at a nursing home anyway. The movers nodded and spread through the house. The ripping of tape, the scraping of furniture, the thud of boxes being dropped, it all began tearing through the warm silence of the home I had spent 35 years protecting. I stepped back into the corner of the living room, leaned quietly against the wall, and folded my arms across my chest. I watched them shove my fine bone china tea set, the one I bought on our 10th anniversary trip, into filthy cardboard boxes. I watched them roll up the landscape painting I had personally won at a charity auction. Piece by piece, memory by memory. 35 years of sweat, sacrifice, and silent endurance were being stripped away from me with brutal indifference. Maya moved through the house like a conqueror. Every now and then she would tap an old wooden piece of furniture with the tip of her heel and tell the movers, "This one is outdated. Throw it in the trash. Don't waste time packing it." She was erasing me from my own home while I was still standing there breathing. The humiliation reached its ugliest point when Maya stopped in front of the glass cabinet filled with family keepsakes. She picked up a framed photograph of me and Harrison when he was 5 years old. She looked at it, smirked, and tossed it carelessly into a box full of old books. Harrison wasn't there. My cowardly son had conveniently claimed he was away on a business trip, so he wouldn't have to witness his mother being thrown out of her own house. He left his wife to do the dirty work for him. And somehow his silence was even crueler than Maya's words. Any other woman might have screamed. She might have clawed at that vicious daughter-in-law called the police, or collapsed on the floor in tears. But I did none of those things. I didn't shed a single tear. I stood there like a lifeless statue and let them pack up my life. On the outside, I looked like a broken old woman who had finally surrendered to the cruelty of her family. But deep inside my mind, every gear of a cold investigative machine was spinning faster than ever. I did not interfere because I was setting the trap. Maya calling in a moving company and seizing my belongings was not just humiliation. It was evidence, clear, undeniable evidence of coercion, unlawful eviction, and illegal trespass. I had anticipated this exact level of arrogance. Inside the artificial flower vase sitting on the television shelf, I had secretly installed a miniature hidden camera. It was recording everything, every insulting word, every smug laugh, every illegal act. The more outrageous Maya became, the deeper she buried herself in a swamp of criminal liability. And Maya was enjoying every second of what she thought was my defeat. She walked over to me, took a slow sip of her coffee, and smiled with fake sympathy. "See, Mom," she said sweetly. "Everything is going so smoothly. Silver Pines already has your special care room prepared. You really don't need to bring much with you. The room is small, just enough for a bed and a little cabinet. A few outfits will be plenty. Harrison wanted to come help, but he's busy in meetings. Don't worry, though. I'll supervise everything personally so nothing gets damaged that you still want to keep." I lowered my head, avoiding her sharp eyes. I let my lips tremble slightly. "I'm feeling a little tired," I murmured in a small, weak voice. "I think I need to lie down upstairs for a while." Maya flicked her hand dismissively, giving me permission to leave as if she owned the place. "Of course," she said in that superior tone. "Your bedroom will be packed last. Everything should be finished by this afternoon." So I turned and walked slowly up the stairs, leaving behind the harsh, tearing sound of tape and cardboard. By late afternoon, as the sun began to set, my living room no longer looked like a home. It looked like a warehouse. Dozens of sealed cardboard boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling, blocking the light from the windows. The warm, peaceful atmosphere of family life had been replaced by the smell of adhesive, damp paper and dust. The house felt hollow and stripped bare like the shell of a dead tree after the life had been sucked out of it. At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, Richard's car pulled into the garage. He came inside, loosening his expensive silk tie. He glanced over the empty walls and the towers of boxes without the slightest trace of sorrow, hesitation, or guilt. He didn't come upstairs to ask how I was feeling. He didn't care that the wife who had served him for 35 years was being boxed up and thrown away. He simply walked over to Maya, nodded in satisfaction, and said in a cold, cutting voice, "Well done, Maya. Make sure everything is cleared out properly, because this weekend I'm hosting a large party here. I'm inviting important business partners and members of the board to my retirement celebration. That will also be the perfect time to officially hand over the keys of this house to you and Harrison. We need the space open, modern, and presentable. We can't let all this old junk embarrass us in front of the guests." From the shadow of the upstairs landing, I heard every single word. Old junk. That was how he now defined our marriage. He wanted to throw a party to celebrate his freedom, to celebrate getting rid of me so he could finally move on with his young mistress Chloe Adams. He wanted to turn my deepest humiliation into a polished stage where he could perform power, generosity, and respectability in front of a room full of wealthy spectators. I turned and went back into the bedroom, the only room they had not fully emptied yet. I stood by the window and looked down at the quiet street below. They thought those cardboard boxes downstairs were symbols of my defeat. They thought I had been crushed into silence and had obediently accepted being discarded. But what they did not know was that inside the worn leather handbag I always kept close to me was a file powerful enough to detonate like a nuclear bomb. It contained offshore bank statements, evidence of money laundering through Maya's cosmetics company, and most importantly, the executed documentation for the irrevocable trust my lawyer had just finalized. They were busy packing boxes inside a house they would never legally own. Every box they sealed was another piece of evidence against them. Every smug smile from Maya, every act of ruthless indifference from Richard was shortening the distance between them and the edge of the cliff. I took a slow sip of my now cold tea, and in the darkness, a faint, icy smile touched my lips. "Go ahead, Maya. Be arrogant, Richard. Make this house spotless. Make it glamorous. Prepare it beautifully for your important guests. Because this weekend's party would not be your coronation. It would be your judgment day. and I would stand there with my own hands, strip away every false mask, expose every betrayal, and cast every last one of you out of my life forever. The next morning, while the movers were still downstairs packing up the last pieces of my life, I quietly walked out to the garage. I started my old car. The engine roared to life. Then I backed out of the driveway and left behind the house soaked in the smell of packing tape and contempt. They thought I was driving myself to Silver Pines, ready to surrender to the fate they had chosen for me. But my car was not headed toward the quiet suburbs. It was headed straight for the financial district, the glittering heart of the city where the filthiest secrets are hidden beneath the most polished surfaces. My first stop was not an ordinary law office. It was the most exclusive private banking branch in the city, the kind of place that only serves clients with a net worth above $10 million. The moment I stepped onto the marble floor of the lobby, the branch manager recognized me. 30 years ago, I had saved his bank from a catastrophic audit disaster. He greeted me with absolute respect. I asked him to open my private safety deposit box in the vault beneath the building. No one in my family knew it existed, not even Richard. It was where I had stored the final pieces of a massive financial puzzle I had been quietly assembling for years. When the heavy steel vault door opened, I sat down at the oak table inside the sterile private room. I took the flash drive I had copied from Richard's cloud system out of my handbag and plugged it into my laptop. Then I spread old bank statements across the table. The familiar feel of numbers sliding beneath my fingertips woke every dormant instinct inside me. Richard had always believed he was a financial genius, but to the eye of a true expert, he was nothing more than an arrogant amateur. He had used an outdated layering scheme. I followed the path of the $2 million, and everything unfolded in front of me like a map. The money had not gone directly into his mistress's account. It had been moved from our joint retirement fund into a shell company called Blue Sea Investment Group, registered in the Cayman Islands, a classic tax haven. From there, the funds had been split into dozens of suspicious transactions, disguised as fake consulting fees, and routed into an anonymous real estate trust. And the sole beneficiary of that trust was none other than Chloe Adams, a cover-up, an asset concealment scheme, a financial trail so dirty it could send him to federal prison for 20 years. But the part that truly disgusted me was not Richard's betrayal. It was Maya's stupidity. My daughter-in-law thought she was blackmailing her father-in-law into handing over a multi-million-dollar home. What she didn't know was that Richard had been using her cosmetics company as a giant laundering machine. I opened her internal audit reports. The company was on the edge of collapse. Retail sales were nearly non-existent, and yet for the past 6 months it had reported massive wholesale profits. I traced the supplier invoices. Maya had signed off on the import of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cosmetic materials from an overseas vendor. But when I cross-checked the tax identification number, the vendor turned out to be a subsidiary secretly owned by Richard. Maya had not sold a single lipstick, not one compact, not one bottle of serum. She had been issuing fake invoices to turn Richard's dirty money into legitimate business revenue, artificially inflating the value of her startup to deceive investors. And in return, Richard funneled money back into her company under the label of angel investment. They had tied themselves into the same legal noose: money laundering, tax fraud, large-scale financial deception. And the cruelest part of all, beneath every corporate loan agreement was Harrison's signature. My son had blindly signed his own financial death warrant just to keep his ambitious wife happy. For one brief second, a flicker of sorrow moved through my chest. Then I extinguished it. Harrison was no longer a 5-year-old boy who needed protection. He was a grown man, and he had chosen to stand with the people who wanted to bury his mother alive. In the world of numbers and crime, emotion is a liability. So I printed every document, organized them carefully, and locked them inside a leather briefcase. My next stop was Jonathan's office. Jonathan was not a decorative little attorney like the puppet Richard had brought into my kitchen that morning. Jonathan was a predator, a true shark in the world of high-net-worth financial litigation, a man who handled the kind of brutal asset wars that destroyed entire dynasties. When I stepped into his office on the 50th floor, he was already waiting. He took one look at my face and understood instantly that this was not a woman arriving to cry over a broken marriage. I placed the briefcase on his desk and slid the entire file toward him. I told him my husband was trying to force me into a nursing home so he could steal my house. I told him Richard had brought a lawyer into my kitchen and pressured me into signing away ownership. Jonathan frowned and picked up the copy of the transfer paper with my shaky signature. He looked at me with sharp confusion and asked why I had surrendered so easily. I smiled and took a small sip of water. Then I told him to open the red folder underneath. Inside was the original deed structure for the irrevocable trust my parents had created 30 years earlier when they purchased that house using the full inheritance of our family estate. Under New York property law, once an asset is placed inside an irrevocable trust, no individual, not even the beneficiary, can transfer or mortgage it without approval from the trust's governing authority. And that governing authority had only one member: me. I held absolute veto power. The paper Richard and Maya had forced me to sign that morning was worthless garbage. But as evidence, it was priceless. It was ironclad proof of elder coercion and attempted property fraud. My trembling signature had not been surrender. It had been bait, and they had swallowed it whole. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, and for the first time I saw something close to admiration in his eyes. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you are a very dangerous woman." I simply nodded. 30 years of obedience had made my family mistake restraint for weakness. I do not use fists. I do not use screaming. I use the law, and I use cold numbers. We spent the next 3 hours preparing the killing blow. I ordered Jonathan to draft an immediate eviction notice. That house had already been quietly sold the morning before to a private real estate development group for $3.5 million. They thought they were throwing me out, but the law was about to throw them onto the street. Then we compiled the complete laundering file on Maya and Richard's tax evasion trail. I personally completed the federal tax fraud complaint. I attached the Cayman Bank statements, the Cartier diamond receipt, and the fake supply chain records from Maya's cosmetics company. When I signed the complaint, my hand was perfectly steady. There was no pity left for the man who betrayed me. No softness left for the people who trampled on my dignity. 1 + 1 always equals 2, and crime plus greed always ends in destruction. By the time I stepped out of Jonathan's office, the city lights had begun to glow. The leather briefcase in my hand now carried the force of a nuclear bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate. This weekend, Richard would host his retirement party. They would raise their glasses and celebrate over the ruins of my life. What they didn't know was that the party would become their final stage, and I would be the one to bring the curtain crashing down. That night, when I returned home from my secret meeting with Jonathan, the living room looked almost completely packed up. Cardboard boxes were stacked so high they felt like prison walls closing in around me. Richard was sitting in the only armchair they hadn't removed yet, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. Maya and Harrison sat across from him, their faces glowing with a kind of excitement that made my skin crawl. The moment I stepped inside, the entire room fell into a calculated silence. Richard set his whiskey glass down on the glass table and looked at me with the smug superiority of a man handing out mercy. "Come here, Evelyn," he ordered. I shuffled forward, lowered my head, and clasped my hands together, playing the role of the defeated, obedient woman to perfection. "This weekend," he began in a grand, booming voice, as if he were addressing a corporate board, "I will be hosting my retirement celebration in this very house. I've invited more than 100 guests, major shareholders, strategic partners, members of the executive board, and even the mayor. It will be a night honoring my extraordinary contributions to the financial world. And it will also be the night we officially announce the transfer of this family's power and assets to Harrison and Maya." Maya leaned in, her eyes glittering with greed she could barely contain. "That's right, Mother," she said sweetly. "Reporters from the local business magazine will be there, too. Richard wants to turn it into a symbol of generational legacy, a perfect family image, happy, united, and full of noble sacrifice. You'll be featured in the press as the loving grandmother who gracefully gave up her home for the next generation." A wave of nausea twisted in my stomach, but I forced it back down. A perfect family image. They were planning to throw me into a nursing home, steal my assets, use my retirement money to support a mistress and a money laundering business. And yet, they wanted me smiling for photographs, performing the role of the loving matriarch in front of cameras. Richard's vanity and cruelty had reached a depth even I had not imagined. He didn't just want to destroy me. He wanted applause for it. He wanted admiration. And here's the most important part. Richard continued leaning forward and pointing a finger straight at my face. To silence any ugly rumors and prove that our family is fully united, I want you to personally hand Maya the symbolic gold key to the house. Then right there on stage in front of all 100 guests, you will sign the final property handover statement. The guests need to see that you are stepping aside willingly and joyfully, making room for the children's future. The final handover statement, legally meaningless, but theatrically perfect. Richard wanted to bind me to a public humiliation. He wanted me to destroy my own dignity with my own hands under the gaze of the city's elite. He wanted me to validate my own disappearance so he could look magnanimous in comparison. I glanced at Harrison. My cowardly son fidgeted and looked away, but he never once opened his mouth to stop any of it. He was completely willing to turn his mother's pain and dignity into entertainment if it meant inheriting a fortune. I stood there feeling my heartbeat grow colder and steadier with each passing second. The mind of a former forensic accountant began analyzing the situation at lightning speed. They were digging themselves into a hole far deeper than anything I could have built for them alone. If Richard had quietly pushed me out, he might have preserved the last scraps of his reputation when my lawyer finally came knocking. But arrogance had blinded him. He wanted a grand stage. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the most powerful people in the financial world watching me sign my surrender. He had built his own execution platform with his own hands. And now he was placing the axe in mine. "Did you hear me?" Evelyn Richards snapped, slamming his palm against the table when I stayed silent too long. "Don't you dare cause problems or start crying at the last minute. All eyes will be on you. And if you ruin my party or embarrass me in front of the mayor, I swear you won't have a single dollar left to survive on. Silver Pines will become a luxury you'll never be able to afford." Slowly, I raised my head. I looked straight into Richard's threatening eyes, then at Maya's satisfied half-smile, and finally at Harrison's pathetic cowardice. I forced every muscle in my face to relax into a weak, faded smile, the smile of a woman who had been completely broken and no longer had any strength left to fight. "I understand," I said. My voice came out so soft, so obedient, so perfectly submissive, that even I almost shivered at how convincing it sounded. "I'll do exactly what you want, Richard. I'll wear my finest dress walk onto that stage and sign whatever you put in front of me. I'll hand over the key and everything else to the children myself. I only ask that you make sure I can live the rest of my days in peace." Richard laughed. It was the satisfied, gloating laugh of a predator who believed he had finally swallowed his prey whole. He leaned back in his chair, lifted his whiskey, and took a slow drink, savoring what he thought was absolute victory. "Good," he said, his tone softening now that he believed I was fully under his control. "Wouldn't it have been easier for everyone if you had just been reasonable from the beginning? Maya tomorrow call the event team. I want this party redesigned from top to bottom. I want it elegant, extravagant, and flawless." I bowed my head one last time in a gesture of surrender, then turned and slowly walked back upstairs to my bedroom. The moment the door closed behind me, the weak smile vanished from my lips. In its place came something cold, sharp, merciless. They wanted a grand performance. They wanted the most powerful people in the city watching. Perfect. I was going to give them a show this city would never forget. Inside my handbag, the documents were already arranged in perfect order: the irrevocable trust, the eviction notice, and the evidence of money laundering. Every trap had been set with surgical precision. Every noose was already hanging around their necks. Now all I had to do was be patient. Pour myself a cup of tea, sit quietly in the dark, and wait for the stage lights to come on. Because when I signed my name that night, I would not be signing away my house. I would be signing the death warrant for everything they had built. By Saturday night, my house was no longer a home. It had been transformed into a lavish, glittering showroom that reeked of money and deception. The event team Maya had hired had worked non-stop for 2 straight days. They erased every last trace of me, replacing the landscape paintings I loved with overpriced abstract art. Dozens of crystal light strands hung across the living room ceiling, casting sharp reflections over a brand-new red velvet carpet. A string quartet played classical music in the corner, the scent of imported white roses mixed with Cuban cigars and top-shelf champagne, creating the suffocating atmosphere of elite hypocrisy. At exactly 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. They stepped out of luxury cars, dressed in gowns and tailored suits that cost more than some people make in months. More than 100 people packed into my living room faces I recognized from business magazines, society pages, and charity galas. Board members, venture capitalists, local politicians, even the mayor himself. They had all come to celebrate Richard, to honor a shining career built on deception, manipulation, and the sweat of other people's sacrifice. I stood on the staircase landing and looked down at the entire rotten crowd. I wore a simple dark blue silk dress, modest and understated, with my silver hair pinned neatly into place. I looked like a ghost in my own house, silent, pale, and invisible. No one looked up at me. No one cared about the woman who had stepped aside for 3 decades so the man in the center of that room could rise. Maya floated through the crowd like a poisonous butterfly. She wore a backless designer gown from Italy that had easily cost $3,000 or more. Diamond bracelets glittered on her wrist, purchased with dirty money washed through her company. She laughed softly, brushed her hand against wealthy investors' arms, and poured out lie after lie with practiced elegance. I heard her telling the mayor's wife, in a voice dripping with fake sorrow, that her mother-in-law's health had declined so much lately, and her memory had gotten so poor that the family had been heartbroken to place her in Silver Pines so she could receive the best possible care. The mayor's wife nodded sympathetically and praised Maya for being such a thoughtful, devoted daughter-in-law. My son Harrison stood right beside her holding a martini, nodding along to every lie that came out of her mouth. He wore an expensive tuxedo, but his posture was small, weak, and spineless, like a puppet without a soul. And then the room shifted. All attention turned toward the front entrance as Richard walked in. He looked like a king inspecting his kingdom. His ash-gray suit was flawlessly tailored, his silver hair slicked back into place, every inch of him radiating arrogance and control. But what made my blood turn cold wasn't his expression. It was the woman on his arm. Chloe Adams, young, blonde, polished. Her skin was flawless, her red silk dress clung to her body like liquid fire, and around her neck was the solid diamond Cartier necklace, the exact $45,000 piece I had seen on the receipt just days earlier. Richard introduced her to the room as the company's new senior executive assistant, the woman who would help him manage his personal ventures after retirement. The older men in the room smiled with quiet understanding. They all knew exactly what kind of relationship existed between a 64-year-old chief financial officer and a 28-year-old assistant wearing Cartier diamonds. But in their world, fidelity was cheap. Money and power covered every sin. So they raised their glasses, congratulated Richard, praised Chloe's beauty and intelligence, and did it all inside my house. I walked down the stairs and entered the crowd. A few people recognized me. They gave me stiff, awkward nods, then quickly looked away as if they were afraid misfortune might be contagious. I didn't care. I moved through their pity and contempt without the slightest sign of discomfort. At the bar, I asked the server for a glass of water. Not champagne, not wine. Water. I needed the clearest mind possible for what was about to happen. Then I looked around the room and saw every face for what it truly was. There was the investment fund director whose tax evasion records I had uncovered 15 years earlier, records Richard had begged me to bury in exchange for stock options. There was the corporate lawyer who had spent years enabling fraudulent contracts and fake transactions. Every smiling face in that room was part of the same rotten ecosystem Richard had built and protected for decades. They did not respect him because he was brilliant. They respected him because he held their filth in his hands. and I, after 30 years of silence, held the filth of all of them. They saw me as harmless, a washed-up old housewife, a woman too soft, too old, too broken to matter. They had no idea I was carrying the master key to every dirty secret in that room. Richard stood only a few feet away from me, his hand resting lightly on Chloe's waist. It was subtle, controlled, almost elegant. But to me, it was the most public humiliation of all. He was laughing as he described his plans to tour Europe next month. Maya stepped beside him, lifted her champagne glass, and lightly tapped it against his. She smiled and said that after tonight, everything would be transferred smoothly, and her cosmetics company would soon launch a new product line thanks to the family's incredible support. A perfect family performance, a flock of vultures tearing apart a body while congratulating each other on the feast. I stood there, took a slow sip of water, and listened to every lie, every laugh, every note of polished cruelty echo through my living room. They were standing on my property, drinking with my money, and planning a future that did not include me. They believed their influence, their wealth, and their carefully arranged corruption made them untouchable. They believed this glittering stage would shine forever. But they had no idea that beneath all that luxury, I had already shattered the structure of this family from the inside out. Every smile Maya gave, every possessive touch Richard placed on his mistress, every cowardly nod from Harrison, each one was a countdown clock ticking toward the destruction of their place in high society. Human corruption had reached its peak. And then, the sharp ringing sound of a silver fork striking a crystal glass cut through the noise. Richard stepped onto the speaking platform, set up in the center of the room. The chandelier light poured over his smug face. The entire room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the powerful chief financial officer. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and smiled as he looked around the room. Then his eyes landed on me. Cold, commanding, certain. It was time for the final performance, time for me to walk onto the execution stage he had prepared so carefully. I set my glass of water down on the table, and at the corner of my mouth a faint smile appeared. The game had begun. Thunderous applause erupted as Richard lightly tapped his silver fork against the crystal glass. The grand hall of the house fell instantly into absolute silence. Hundreds of eyes, the eyes of some of the most powerful figures in New York's financial world, shifted toward the speaking platform set up in the center of the living room. Richard stood there beneath the blazing chandelier light, looking like an emperor preparing to bestow one final act of generosity before handing over his throne. He wore a smile that had clearly been practiced in the mirror-warm noble and utterly false. My friend's Richard began, his deep, polished voice echoing through the expensive sound system. Tonight is not only a celebration of my career, tonight is also a moment of great transition. For 35 years, I have built not only a financial empire, but a strong and lasting home. But time spares no one, and the older generation must know when to step aside and make room for the young. Today, my devoted wife Evelyn and I have come to a deeply meaningful decision. We will officially hand over the key to this house, the symbol of everything we have built, to our son Harrison and his wife Maya. A few scattered claps started from the crowd, then swelled into roaring applause. Guests nodded in admiration, praising the great generosity of the powerful chief financial officer. They were completely deceived by this flawless performance of hypocrisy. In one corner of the room, I saw Chloe Adams's young mistress raising her champagne glass, a smug smile curling across her lips. She knew exactly what that key had cost. She was celebrating the fact that I was about to be thrown out of my own home so she could step into Richard's life without shame or obstacle. And now Richard continued, extending one arm toward me, his tone turning so sweet it made me sick. I'd like to invite my life partner Evelyn to come up here and join me in this sacred handover ceremony. Please give her a round of applause for her silent sacrifice and dedication. Every eye in the room immediately turned toward me. Hundreds of people in glittering gowns, tailored tuxedos, and flashing diamonds looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I stood still for a beat and took one long breath, letting the cold air of the room fill my lungs. Then I began to walk. I did not rush. I did not deliberately slow down. I walked with the steady, silent steps of a woman who had spent a lifetime being treated like a shadow. My dark blue silk dress brushed softly over the red velvet carpet as the crowd slowly parted to either side, creating a narrow path that led straight to the stage. As I stepped onto the small staircase, Richard reached out a hand to help me. His hand was cold, hard. He gripped my fingers tightly, a squeeze full of threat disguised as affection. On the small oak table in the center of the platform, the property transfer papers had already been laid out in perfect order. Beside them sat a gleaming gold-plated pen under the lights. This contract had been reprinted in a larger font, more elegant and ceremonial, so it would look fitting for a public signing. Attorney Sterling, that filthy puppet Richard called a lawyer, stood near the platform with his arms folded, smiling and nodding at me. Maya and Harrison had already stepped onto the stage and taken their places on the opposite side. Maya wore her designer gown, both hands clasped in front of her chest, her eyes locked on the document with wild, hungry greed. Harrison kept his old habit head lowered, unable to look me in the eye. He looked like an accomplice waiting for the victim's final breath so he could divide the spoils. "Sign it, Evelyn," Richard whispered through clenched teeth, the smile on his face never once shifting as he kept it aimed at the audience. "Finish this and you'll have your peace in that nursing home. Don't embarrass me." I lowered my eyes to the white page. The words, "Transfer of full ownership to Nova Beauty, LLC," were printed in bold, unmistakable letters. They had cornered me. They had brought hundreds of powerful witnesses here to watch my surrender. They wanted to use the pressure of the crowd to crush whatever final resistance I had left. In the eyes of these guests, I was nothing more than a confused old woman voluntarily surrendering her assets and disappearing into the darkness. Slowly, I reached out my hand. My fingers touched the cool surface of the gold-plated pen. In that instant, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even the string quartet sounded quieter, as if the rustle of paper itself had taken over the air. Maya leaned forward slightly, her lips parting, her breathing growing shallow and urgent. Richard released my hand and straightened his posture, carrying himself with the pride of a man who believed he had already won. I lifted the pen. I was no longer pretending to tremble. I was no longer acting frightened. I held that pen with perfect steadiness. Then I looked directly into Maya's eyes. The fake smile on her lips stiffened for the briefest fraction of a second when she met the ice in my gaze. But greed had already blinded her reason. She simply gave me a small nod, urging me to put the pen to paper. I shifted my eyes to Richard. He narrowed his eyes for a moment, suddenly wary, but then his smug confidence returned. And then I bent down. I placed the pen on the page. I did not hesitate. With one smooth, powerful, deliberate stroke, I signed my name, Evelyn Mercer, across the blank signature line marked for the transferring party. My signature stretched long and sharp across the page without the slightest tremor. It was not the handwriting of a defeated woman. It was the handwriting of a woman sealing the coffin shut on her enemies with her own hand. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, a collective breath of relief escaped from Richard, Maya, and Attorney Sterling. Maya couldn't contain herself. She stepped forward and threw her arms around me in a cold, fake embrace soaked in expensive perfume. "Thank you, Mother," she whispered into my ear, her voice drenched in triumph and arrogance. "You've done the right thing. This house is finally safe in our hands now." Richard picked up the document and held it high for the guests to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is official," he declared. Applause exploded through the room. The sound crashed off the walls, rang through the crystal glasses, and became a symphony of lies. Guests lifted their drinks in celebration. Business partners smiled and praised the perfect arrangement of such a respectable family. Maya stood there, waving to the room like a queen newly crowned. Harrison stood beside her with a stiff, uneasy smile, but even he looked relieved that he would no longer have to wrestle with the last scraps of his conscience. They were drowning in the illusion of victory. They believed my signature was the final end of Evelyn Mercer in their world. They thought that by tomorrow I would quietly carry my suitcase into a nursing home and leave them free to strip away everything I had spent a lifetime building. The room was swollen with smugness, arrogance, and satisfaction. Not one of them noticed that I had not set the gold-plated pen down. I was still holding it tightly in my hand, standing silently in the center of that platform, my dry eyes studying every smile, every clap, every face glowing with false triumph. They had their performance. Now it was my turn to deliver the punishment. The instant my pen left the paper, a collective sigh of relief escaped Richard, Maya, and Attorney Sterling. They started clapping. Below the stage, hundreds of guests joined in their applause, blending into the false rhythm of a perfect family performance. But I did not set the gold-plated pen down. I did not step back. I did not turn and walk off that platform like an obedient loser. Instead, I reached for the microphone resting on its stand. Richard frowned and lunged forward, clearly intending to snatch it from me, but I was faster. I grabbed the microphone, pulled it free, and turned to face the crowd. The speakers let out a sharp burst of feedback that sliced straight through the applause. The entire room fell silent. Richard froze. The smile on his face tightened into something strained and unnatural. His eyes sharpened with a silent warning, but with hundreds of business partners watching, he had no choice but to keep pretending to be gracious. He stepped back half a pace and gave me space as though he expected me to deliver some tearful speech of gratitude before saying goodbye to the house. I looked directly at the sea of faces staring back at me, the expensive evening gowns, the glittering crystal glasses, the curious eyes, the pity. I took one deep breath. The air filled my lungs cool and clear, and when I finally spoke, my voice did not shake. It did not sound like the voice of a frightened old woman. It was low, steady, commanding. It rang through that glittering room with the force of a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Thank you," I began. "Thank you all for being here tonight to witness this historic moment with our family. Richard is absolutely right. Tonight is a night of transition, a night to look back on the last 35 years." I paused and turned my eyes toward Richard. He was standing there with his chest slightly lifted, ready to receive praise. "Richard is an incredibly careful man," I continued. "He is a brilliant chief financial officer. In 35 years of marriage, I have watched him build an empire from nothing. He never makes a decision without calculating every number, every risk, every loophole. He knows how to control everything. He knows how to move money with remarkable artistry so well that no one ever notices." A murmur of amusement rippled through the crowd. A few guests smiled, lifted their glasses, even winked at Richard. They thought I was joking. They thought I was praising his business genius. Richard himself chuckled and nodded, accepting the compliment. Maya stood nearby with her arms folded, her bright red lips curled into a smug smile. She clearly believed I was trying to salvage the last scraps of my dignity by flattering the husband who had discarded me before shipping me off to a nursing home. But then I kept going. "But Richard is also a very practical man," I said, slowing my pace, letting every word fall clear and sharp like a hammer striking ice. "When he decided to hand this house over to my daughter-in-law, Maya's cosmetics company, he designed a flawless plan. He brought a lawyer right into my kitchen. He shoved a power of attorney in front of me and forced me to sign. He told me I was old, confused, and ready for a nursing home. He prepared an entire future designed to remove me quietly so he could enjoy the rest of his life with the young, beautiful assistant standing right over there." I lifted my arm and pointed directly at Chloe Adams beside the bar. A cold shock seemed to sweep across the room. Chloe's smile froze on her face. The champagne glass in her hand trembled, spilling droplets onto her expensive silk dress. Guests began turning toward one another in confusion. A nervous whisper spread across the room. The polished elegance of the evening began to crack. Richard went pale. The fake warmth drained from his face instantly. He strode toward me and reached for the microphone. "Evelyn, you've lost your mind," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Get off this stage right now." But I did not move. I twisted away from his hand and kept speaking into the microphone, my voice now colder, harder, sharper than steel. "Don't touch me, Richard. You wanted a public performance. You wanted hundreds of witnesses to admire your generosity. Then let them hear the rest of the story." I turned back to the crowd. As I said, Richard calculates everything perfectly. He calculated the transfer of $2 million out of our retirement fund to purchase a luxury apartment in Manhattan for his mistress. He calculated how to use his daughter-in-law's cosmetics company to launder dirty money. He calculated how to buy his own son's silence with this very house. And together, they forced me to sign papers in front of all of you to legitimize what was nothing more than a public robbery. The room had gone completely still. No one moved. No one dared raise another glass. The string quartet had stopped playing without anyone even noticing. All that remained was a silence so deep it felt violent. Maya's mouth fell open. Her face turned ghost white, her arms dropped uselessly to her sides, and suddenly that $1,000 gown looked like nothing more than a rag hanging off a desperate fraud. Harrison staggered back a step and grabbed the edge of the oak table with trembling hands, breathing like a drowning man. Attorney Sterling was sweating now, his eyes darting frantically around the room, already looking for an exit. Then I turned and locked eyes with Richard. His eyes were bloodshot. His jaw was clenched so hard it looked as if it might crack. He stood there frozen, unable to speak. "But Richard," I said slowly, each word echoing with dreadful precision, "you were so busy hiding offshore statements in the Cayman Islands that you forgot the most basic law of truth." I lowered the microphone slightly and let a deadly silence settle over the room for several seconds. The only sounds were Richard's strained breathing and the faint clink of crystal as someone in the crowd trembled. Then I lifted the property transfer document I had just so obediently signed and held it high beneath the chandelier light. Any transfer document becomes worthless trash the second the signer has no legal authority to dispose of the asset. I declared, my voice carrying through the room with the force of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You assumed that because my name was on the deed, I had the power to hand this house over to your daughter-in-law's company. You were wrong." And then I let the paper fall. It drifted through the air and landed face up on the red velvet carpet like a dead leaf. My signature, the one they had mistaken for surrender, lay there in plain sight, utterly stripped of legal power. Their triumph had lasted 5 minutes, and now beneath their polished shoes, the ground had officially begun to split apart. I bent down slowly and picked up the transfer document I had just signed. The air inside the ballroom had grown so thick with tension that no one even dared to breathe too loudly. I looked straight at the smile freezing on Maya's face and the panic spreading through Richard's eyes. They could not understand why a defeated old woman would dare stand on that stage and throw away the very paper they believed would secure their victory. Then I reached into my worn leather handbag, the same handbag Maya had once sneered at and called cheap and pathetic. From inside, I pulled out a thick legal file neatly stapled and stamped with the bright red seal of New York State. I stepped toward the oak table and slammed the file down beside that worthless transfer document. The dry, violent crack of it echoed through the microphone and rang across the ears of every guest standing frozen in silence. "You forgot something, Richard," I said, my voice clear and razor-sharp, my eyes locked onto him like blades. 35 years ago when we bought this house, you were nothing more than a broke intern drowning in student debt. You didn't have a single dollar for the down payment. Every brick, every wall, every square foot of this house was purchased with 100% of the inheritance my parents left to me. I paused just long enough to let the truth sink into the room. Whispers immediately began to spread through the crowd. Several board members turned toward Richard with expressions full of suspicion. They had always believed he was the financial savior of this family. Now that illusion was being torn off in front of all of them. "And because it was purchased with my inheritance," I continued, "I never held it jointly. I worked with a real attorney, not the cheap puppet lawyer you dragged into my kitchen this morning. This house was placed directly into an irrevocable trust with me as the beneficiary and the only person with controlling authority." Then I turned toward Sterling. By now, the pathetic little lawyer was visibly shaking, sweat pouring down his bald forehead. I shoved the red file toward him. "Read it," I ordered, my tone so sharp it left no room for resistance. "Read Clause 7 out loud for your client and for every person in this room." Sterling hesitated. His trembling hands opened the file. He turned the pages, and his eyes widened as if he had just seen a ghost. He was a terrible lawyer, but he still knew enough to understand the crushing legal weight of the words in front of him. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice breaking apart. "Under New York law, any property held inside an irrevocable trust cannot be transferred, pledged, or mortgaged by anyone, not even the beneficiary, without formal court authorization. The power of attorney and the transfer document from this morning, they are completely void." A cold smile spread across my face. "That's right, Sterling," I said. "That paper is trash, but it makes beautiful evidence for a charge of conspiracy to defraud and unlawfully seize the property of an elderly woman. You're a lawyer. You know exactly how many years in prison that can carry, don't you?" Sterling stumbled backward 2 steps. He stuffed his own papers into his leather briefcase with frantic hands, then turned on Richard with pure hatred in his eyes. "You lied to me, Mr. Mercer," he hissed. "You told me she was the sole owner and fully competent to transfer the asset. I want no part of this. I'm done." And with that, the coward shoved his way through the crowd and fled the house like a rat escaping a sinking ship. Maya watched the entire thing with horror spreading across her face. Every scheme, every fantasy she had built around using this house to rescue her rotten cosmetics company was being ground into dust right in front of her eyes. "No!" she screamed, lunging toward the file on the table. "You're lying! You're just a freeloading old woman! Richard paid the mortgage. Richard kept this family alive. Those documents are fake." I turned so fast my dress cut through the air. I looked straight into Maya's twisted, desperate face, and when I spoke there was no restraint left in my voice. It was the sound of rage that had been buried for 30 years finally tearing its way into the open. "Do not raise your voice at me in my house, Maya," I said. "You call me a parasite every chance you get, but what you never knew is that for the last 35 years I have used the income from that trust to pay the property taxes and maintain the upper-class illusion this family lived inside. You thought you were smart enough to deceive a former forensic accountant. You are nothing but a greedy child playing with numbers you are too ignorant to understand." Only then did Harrison stumble forward, finally panicking enough to reach for his wife's arm. "Maya, calm down," he muttered weakly. But Maya jerked away from him and pointed a shaking finger straight at me, her breathing ragged and uneven. "You can't do this," she spat. "If we don't have this house, my company is finished. The creditors will seize everything. Mom, you can't be this heartless. You can't push your own son into ruin like this." I looked at my daughter-in-law as she collapsed from arrogance into pathetic begging, and a wave of disgust rose inside me so strong it almost tasted bitter. "I am not the one pushing you into ruin, Maya," I said. "You buried yourselves the moment you chose to protect Richard's filth and make me the sacrifice. Did you really think sending me to a nursing home would solve everything? Did you really think you could steal the sweat and sacrifice of my life so neatly? I am not standing here tonight to beg for mercy. I am standing here to take back every dollar every one of you owes me." By then, the room had completely shattered. The guests, the same people who had been raising their glasses in celebration just minutes earlier, were now watching the violent collapse of a so-called respectable family with their own eyes. Even the glittering chandelier lights felt harsher now, almost mocking. Richard stood there, his face shifting from pale to dark red with fury. His hands were curled into fists so tight they looked ready to break. Veins stood out in his neck. His eyes were full of blood and hatred. He knew he had already lost the house. What he still didn't know was that the most devastating blow, the sharpest blade, was still waiting inside that red file of mine, ready to destroy not just his home, but the career and reputation he had spent a lifetime worshipping. Maya's panic still hadn't stopped. Her chest rose and fell violently beneath that expensive dress. Her trembling hand pointed at me, but no more words came out. Beside her, Richard stood, rigid, sweat pouring down his forehead, his teeth grinding together so hard I could hear the vicious scrape of it. They thought me keeping the house through the trust was the worst punishment I could possibly deliver. They thought I would use my power as trustee to throw them out and then spend the rest of my life alone inside this cold, empty mansion. They were wrong again. Once again, their imagination was far too small for what a forensic accountant is capable of. I calmly slipped my hand into my worn leather handbag one more time. Every eye in the room followed the movement. The guests began holding their breath. This time I pulled out a thinner set of documents carefully tucked inside a pale yellow envelope. I looked at Maya and gave her a hollow smile, that carried no sympathy at all. "Maya," I said slowly, my voice echoing through the living room speakers, each word sharp and deliberate. "You never stopped complaining that this house was too old. You wanted to tear down the living room wall. You wanted to throw out my furniture. You mocked my taste and called it outdated. Well then, you don't need to worry about renovating it anymore. Because yesterday morning, while you were busy ordering movers to stuff my belongings into those cheap cardboard boxes, I was sitting in my attorney's office, finalizing the sale of this house." A stunned gasp exploded across the room. Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Richard's eyes flew wide open. He stumbled back half a step, as if someone had driven an invisible fist straight into his chest. "Sold," I repeated loud and clear. "The entire property and this house have already been sold to Pinnacle Development Group for $3.5 million in cash. The money was transferred directly into the trust account, and not one single cent belongs to this family. Pinnacle has no interest in preserving your filthy little memories. They plan to level this entire property by the end of the month and build a luxury condominium complex in its place. That wall you wanted to tear down, Maya, it's going to be crushed into dust by bulldozers." I stepped forward and threw the pale yellow envelope hard onto the oak table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of Maya. "Inside that envelope is an eviction order effective immediately," I said, my voice cold and final, like a judge's gavel striking wood. "Pinnacle's legal representative has already signed it. You are standing on someone else's property. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up everything you own and get out. If you are still anywhere on these grounds after noon tomorrow, the county sheriff will personally remove you for unlawful trespassing." Maya stared at the yellow envelope as though it were a bomb about to explode. Her shaking hands reached for the document. She pulled it out and scanned the bold lines of text. The second she saw the bright red seal and the signature from the development company's legal representative, all strength left her body. She collapsed to the floor. Both hands flew to her head as broken sobs tore out of her throat. Her $1,000 dress dragged across the red velvet carpet, and suddenly she looked less like a queen and more like a peacock stripped of every feather. "You should feel lucky, Maya," I said, looking down at her from above. "Yesterday morning you were thoughtful enough to hire movers and bring dozens of cardboard boxes. You worked so hard packing things up. How convenient. Now all you have to do is rip that tape back open, put my things where they belong, and stuff your own glamorous dresses into those boxes instead. And do it quickly. 24 hours goes by very fast." Only then did Harrison finally panic enough to drop to his knees beside his wife. He grabbed her shoulders with both hands and looked up at me, his eyes full of horror and pleading. "Mom," he cried, "you can't do this. $3.5 million. You have that much money. Why can't you just give us a small portion to save Maya's company? If we get thrown out, we'll be bankrupt. The creditors will take the cars, the credit cards, everything. Do you really want your own son out on the street?" I looked at Harrison, the son I had carried inside my body, the son I had given my youth to raise. But the love of a mother inside me had already been murdered by his cowardice and his betrayal. "I have no obligation to rescue you from the filth you created," I said coldly. "You chose to stand beside your father and your wife. You chose to deceive me, force me into a nursing home, and steal my property. The moment you signed your name on Maya's fraudulent laundering paperwork, you stripped yourself of the right to call yourself my son. Take responsibility for your own life, Harrison. Your free bank has officially shut down." Below the stage, the guests were beginning to shift in a very noticeable way. The board members, the business partners, the same people who had been clapping for Richard only minutes earlier. Now they were quietly stepping backward. The whispering in the room was no longer curiosity. It had turned into disgust. High society is practical to the point of cruelty. They may tolerate an affair. They may ignore dirty business tactics. But they will never stay attached to a failure so pathetic and so stupid that he gets publicly exposed by his own wife in front of a crowd. I watched the mayor's wife wrinkle her face in disapproval, then turn and walk straight toward the front door without even bothering to say goodbye. The investment fund director, who had been flattering Richard all evening, shook his head in contempt and motioned for his family to bring his coat. One by one, they began pulling away from Richard's family as if scandal itself were contagious. They were distancing themselves before the money laundering and fraud investigation exploded. The glittering party had become a public trial, and Richard's family were the ones standing in the center of it, condemned under the weight of hundreds of humiliated eyes. Richard stood alone on that platform, surrounded by ruin. He watched the important guests streaming toward the exits. He watched his daughter-in-law sobbing on the floor. He watched his son trembling in helpless terror. The pride of a powerful chief financial officer had been crushed beyond recognition. But he still did not know that the deadliest blow, the final strike reserved just for him, had not even been delivered yet. So I stood there calm and powerful, waiting for the perfect moment to strip away the very last breath of dignity he had left. Maya's collapse and that eviction notice were only the appetizer. The ballroom had sunk into a storm of disgusted whispers, and Richard had finally realized he was no longer in control. The polished mask of the charming, respected chief financial officer had been ripped clean off, exposing the true face of a man cornered beyond escape. His face burned crimson. Blue veins bulged across his forehead. His breathing turned heavy, raw, animalistic. His arrogance had curdled into blind, unhinged rage. He no longer cared that hundreds of elite guests were watching him. With a furious roar, he slapped the microphone off the podium. It crashed against the hardwood floor with a piercing screech that made several guests cover their ears. Then Richard lunged straight at me, both massive hands raised high, ready to bring down a brutal, violent blow across my face. The guests below screamed in horror. A few men tried to rush forward to stop him, but they were too far away. He thought violence was the only weapon he had left. He thought he could silence me, break me, and bury the truth with one last act of force. But I didn't move. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I didn't close my eyes. I stood tall, chin lifted, staring straight into the face of the beast charging toward me. And just as his hand came within inches of my face, I calmly raised my right arm. Not to block him, but to press a tiny black remote control I had hidden in my palm since the beginning of the party. A sharp beep cut through the room. In the next instant, every glittering crystal light in the ballroom went black. The house plunged into darkness for a fraction of a second before a blinding white beam from the ceiling projector exploded across the massive wall behind the stage. The very wall that had been prepared to display a glamorous tribute video celebrating Richard's 35-year career. The light was so sudden, so harsh, that Richard staggered and threw up his arm to shield his eyes, bending forward on reflex. His cowardly attack was stopped cold by the one thing he had never been able to control: the truth. I stepped aside so the entire room could see what was now projected across that giant screen. There was no tribute video. What appeared instead was a detailed bank statement from a private financial institution in the Cayman Islands. Black numbers stood out against the white background, clear, precise, impossible to deny. I raised my voice. I no longer needed a microphone. My words cut through every corner of that dead, silent room. What you are looking at, I declared, is the statement for Richard Mercer's hidden personal account, and the transaction highlighted in yellow, right in the center of that screen, is a $2 million cash transfer. That money was siphoned directly out of our joint retirement fund and moved into an anonymous real estate trust for the purpose of concealing assets. I clicked the remote again. The next image appeared: a purchase contract for a luxury apartment in downtown Manhattan, and the beneficiary's name was enlarged across nearly a third of the screen: Chloe Adams. The entire ballroom turned toward the bar in one motion. Chloe, the mistress disguised as a senior executive assistant, stood frozen in place. Her carefully perfected face had gone ghost white. Her hand trembled so badly that her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the hardwood floor. The crack of breaking glass rang through the stunned silence. Guests instinctively moved away from her, leaving a wide circle of contempt around her body. Wealthy society wives looked at her with naked disgust, as if she were nothing more than a gold-digging parasite. "You thought you could use violence against me, Richard," I said, turning back toward the man, now hunched beneath the projector light, trembling and shielding his face. "You thought one slap could erase the evidence that you used this family's blood, sweat, and sacrifices to bankroll your mistress?" I paused. "But that betrayal is only the garbage in your private life. What I'm about to show these distinguished guests is your real area of expertise." I lifted the remote again. The kind of expertise that sends a man straight to federal prison. The screen changed once more. Now it displayed dozens of import invoices from Nova Beauty Maya's cosmetics company. Beside them appeared internal cash flow reports from the corporation, where Richard had served as chief financial officer. Red arrows drawn and arranged by me in advance connected transaction after transaction with brutal clarity. Any investor, financial analyst, or board member in that room needed only 5 seconds to understand exactly what they were seeing. This, I said, my voice now carrying the cold, precise authority of a forensic accountant, is how your great chief financial officer really operates. Maya issued fraudulent invoices for cosmetic shipments that never existed. The so-called supplier was actually a shell subsidiary secretly controlled by Richard. He used his daughter-in-law's company to launder dirty money and conceal millions in tax fraud. Then he funneled the cleaned money back into her company under the label of angel investment. Together, they created a perfect loop for siphoning money out of the very shareholders standing in this room tonight. The murmurs in the crowd turned into real outrage. Board members who had just been raising glasses in Richard's honor were now seething with fury. They realized they had been made fools of, deceived, exploited, and robbed under their own noses. One elderly member of the board stormed forward and pointed straight at Richard. "What the hell did you do with our money, Richard?" he thundered. "I'm calling in an independent audit team first thing tomorrow morning, and you'd better start looking for a criminal defense lawyer tonight." Other investors were already yanking out their phones. They were not calling for cars. They were calling their legal teams, right there in the middle of the party. They were demanding immediate freezes on every account, every project, and every financial structure tied to Richard Mercer. The luxury and glamour of the evening were ripped to pieces, replaced by the chaos of powerful people scrambling to save their fortunes from a ship that had already begun to sink. Richard dropped to one knee. The truth and the crushing pressure from the very people who controlled his professional fate had broken whatever remained of his resistance. He clutched his chest, gasping in painful, uneven bursts. Then he looked up at me. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was cowardly desperation. "Evelyn," he rasped, "please, turn it off. Don't do this. I've lost everything. I'll give you the house back. Please, have mercy." I stepped to the edge of the stage and looked down at the pathetic shell of the man who had once been my husband. "You haven't lost everything yet, Richard," I said softly, but my voice was sharp enough for the microphone system to catch every syllable. "You still have one final reward waiting for you." Then I pressed the remote one last time. The screen shifted to an electronic confirmation letter stamped with the unmistakable eagle seal of the federal government. It was official proof that the case file had already been submitted to the Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes investigators. I filed the full complaint at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I announced, every fake invoice, every hidden offshore account, every dollar you stole and every dollar you hid from the government is now sitting neatly on the desks of federal agents. While you were busy trying on that expensive tuxedo, while Maya was busy stuffing my belongings into trash boxes to throw me out of my own home, I was packaging up your entire life and handing it to the law. I took one slow breath and looked directly into Richard's shattered face. You will not be spending retirement in a beachside villa. You will not be enjoying a Manhattan apartment with your mistress. You are going to spend at least the next 20 years in a federal prison. Then I turned my gaze toward Maya, and your beloved daughter-in-law will be getting her own private cell for conspiracy money laundering and fraud. I dropped the remote control onto the carpet in front of Richard. It bounced once, then lay still. The ballroom now looked like the aftermath of a war. Guests were pushing past one another to get out the door, not one of them willing to be associated with this rotten family for another second. Chloe Adams had already fled, abandoning her shattered champagne glass on the floor. Harrison had collapsed against the wall, sobbing with the late, useless grief of a coward. Maya lay sprawled across the carpet, her eyes vacant, her body limp like a beautiful corpse drained of all life. And Richard, the once powerful chief financial officer, was now nothing more than a 64-year-old man facing ruin, disgrace debt, and criminal prosecution. I stepped down from the stage and walked straight through the wreckage. My spine was straight. My stride was calm, measured, authoritative. For 35 years, I had used silence and endurance to build and protect that man. But tonight, I had forged that same silence into the sharpest blade of all and used it to take back everything that was mine. The purge was over, and I, the forgotten woman they thought they could erase, was the only one left standing on the ashes of their empire. Chaos spread through the living room like a fire no one could contain. No one cared about the polished manners of high society anymore. The distinguished guests, the major shareholders, the same people who had been raising their glasses to Richard just minutes earlier, were now shoving past one another in a frantic rush toward the front door. Crystal glasses shattered across the floor. Red wine spilled over the velvet carpet like streaks of blood. No one wanted their name tied to a federal fraud and money laundering scandal. They fled this house as if it had been infected with something deadly. Chloe Adams, the young mistress disguised as an assistant, reacted the fastest. The moment she realized that the $2 million apartment in Manhattan and every luxury attached to it were about to be frozen by federal authorities, her eyes widened in horror. She didn't spare a single glance for the 64-year-old man collapsing on the stage. Instead, she ripped the $45,000 Cartier diamond necklace from her throat and threw it onto the table like a cursed object, then gathered up the hem of her red silk dress and ran straight into the night. She understood the rules of gold diggers better than anyone. Once the mine collapses, the only thing left to do is run. Then another piercing sound tore through the suffocating air. Maya screamed. She hurled herself at Harrison like a wild animal clawing at his expensive tuxedo with both hands. "You useless coward!" She shrieked, tears streaking through her makeup until her face looked grotesque and ruined. "You told me your family was rich. You told me this house would be ours. And now what? You're nothing. A spineless man without a dollar to your name. The creditors are going to destroy me. They're going to seize my company. This is all your fault, yours and your disgusting family's." She kept pounding her fists against Harrison's chest, her nails ripping through the silk of his shirt beneath the jacket. Harrison didn't fight back. He stumbled backward and let her tear into him, his eyes hollow and lifeless. In that moment, he understood the truth too late. The wife he had worshipped, the woman he had been willing to sacrifice his own mother for, was now looking at him like he was nothing but trash. Without money, Harrison was nothing to her. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his head in both hands, sobbing in broken, desperate gasps. Love, respect, status, all of it had been an illusion built on lies. And now that illusion had shattered completely. He had traded away the one person who truly loved him for a ruthless woman, and now he had lost them both. Then Richard's phone started ringing. The sound was relentless, shrill, merciless, like a funeral bell. His trembling hand pulled the phone from his pocket. On the screen was the name of the chairman of the board. Richard didn't answer. The call stopped. Another one came in immediately. This time it was the head of the largest investment bank tied to his career. Richard already knew what was waiting for him on the other end. They were calling to cut every tie freeze, every account, and strip him of every last shred of power before the tax investigation hit the newspapers the next morning. 35 years of his career as a celebrated chief financial officer had been erased in less than 15 minutes. In the brutal world of high finance, no one rushes to save a man whose wife has publicly exposed his crimes with evidence no one can deny. Richard dropped the phone. It hit the floor and shattered, but the ringing continued cruel and unstoppable. Then he looked up at me. The arrogance was gone. The coldness was gone. The threats were gone. All that remained was a pathetic, frightened old man on the edge of complete ruin. He dropped to his knees and crawled across broken crystal, not even noticing the blood on his legs until he reached me. Then his hands clutched the hem of my silk dress. Tears streamed down his face. "Evelyn!" He choked out, his voice breaking apart. "Please. For the sake of our 35 years together, please withdraw the complaint. I'll return every dollar of the retirement money. I'll leave this house. I'll never show my face in front of you again. Please don't let me go to prison. At my age, I'll die in there. I'm begging you, Evelyn. You've always been a merciful woman. Please, give me a way out." I looked down into his eyes. There was no remorse there, no regret for the pain he had caused me, only terror at the thought of punishment. And I felt nothing, not pity, not softness, not the slightest crack in the ice that had formed inside my heart. Slowly I pulled my dress free from his filthy hands. Then I reached into my old leather handbag once more. My movements were calm, controlled, almost gentle, the complete opposite of the screaming chaos around me. I pulled out a small object and dropped it onto the wooden floor right in front of him. It hit with a dry, metallic clatter. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a legal file. It was the tape measure. The same metal tape measure Maya had used to size up my living room on the night Richard casually announced that I would be sent away to Silver Pines. A cold, merciless smile touched my lips. 35 years together, Richard, I said softly, but my voice was sharp enough to cut straight through him. You destroyed that with your own hands the moment you stood there and watched your daughter-in-law use this tape measure to divide up my life. You let her measure my space while I was still breathing. You nodded along while they planned to throw me away like garbage. And now you think the law is some little game you can beg your way out of. The federal government doesn't believe in mercy, Richard. I took one step back, every inch of me calm, upright, and utterly without mercy. So now pick it up, I said. Take the tape measure, Richard. You're going to need it. Use it to measure the size of your federal prison cell. See whether it has enough room for your giant ego and your bottomless greed. The game is over. Whatever road is left from here, you walk it alone. Then I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked slowly through the living room, now hollow and silent. Maya's screams, Harrison's sobs, Richard's broken breathing, all of it faded behind me with every step. I opened the front door and stepped into the night. The cool, clean autumn air touched my face. I took one long, deep breath and felt freedom for the first time in 35 years. The life of the forgotten woman had finally come to an end, and the radiant second chapter of my life had only just begun. Top of form, bottom of form. 3 months have passed since the night everything collapsed. Now I'm sitting on the balcony of a sun-drenched penthouse overlooking Miami Beach. The ocean breeze moves gently through my hair, carrying that clean, salty edge of the sea. There's no more smell of cheap cardboard boxes and packing tape. No more clouds of heavy perfume from fake high society guests. And most importantly, no more suffocating air from a marriage built on lies. I take a slow sip of fine wine and let myself savor the absolute silence of the late afternoon. Then the phone on the glass table beside me suddenly lights up and begins to vibrate. An incoming call. Unknown number. New York area code. A federal prison call. Harrison again. This is the 5th time he's called this week. In the voicemails he left before this, he was practically sobbing, begging me to send bail money to get his father out, or at the very least give him and Maya enough cash to hire lawyers and save her cosmetics company, now that all of its assets have been frozen. I stare at the glowing numbers on the screen. There was a time when my heart would race in panic every time my son called me, but not anymore. Now my heartbeat stays calm, steady, unmoved. I don't feel anger anymore. I don't even feel heartbreak. All I feel is a quiet, empty stillness. I pick up the phone, but I don't answer. With one firm movement, I block the number forever. No hesitation, no guilt, no mercy. They treated me like a free bank for years. That bank is permanently closed. At 62, I decided to stop being a blindly self-sacrificing mother. I stopped being the wife who spent her whole life standing behind someone else. From this day forward, I answer to no one but myself. The stillness of the sunset wraps around me like an old friend. The years I have left belong to me now, and I will never let anyone drain them from me again. My story may not be a fairy tale with a happy family reunion, but it is a true story of awakening. So if you're a woman stepping into the later years of life, if you gave your youth away, stepped back, let your husband and children stand in the spotlight only to be treated like an invisible burden in return, then I want you to remember this. Never set yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. Your money is your money. Your peace is yours to protect. And never underestimate the power of a woman who spent 30 years quietly cooking meals for her family, because she knows exactly where the sharpest knife is hidden. Life does not end at 50. It does not end at 60. Sometimes that's exactly when it begins, the moment you finally decide to stop serving people who never deserved you. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, would you stay silent just to preserve the illusion of a fake family? Or would you sell everything, walk away, travel the world, and finally live for yourself? Share your story with me in the comments below. I read every comment, and I truly value every one of them. And if this story gave you the strength to stand up and protect your own worth, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope each of you finds the freedom you truly deserve.